Hello, and welcome to today's SSP virtual seminar, Seeking Sustainability, Publishing Models for an Open Access Age. My name is Mary Beth Barilla, and I'm the Program Director here at SSP. We are very pleased that you can join us today. Although we had hoped to see many of you in Brighton with our friends at UKSG, we're very happy to host you in our online conference. Thank you all for being flexible and accommodating us at this challenging time. We would also like to thank our sponsors, Cabell Scholarly Analytics, as well as the Charleston Library Conference. We are grateful for your support. So before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to review. Your phone will be muted automatically in consideration of our presenters and your fellow participants. Please use the question feature on the GoToWebinar control panel to send questions to the panelists. You can also use this feature to flag any technical problems you might experience. Questions will be compiled for the presenters at the end of the keynote and then again at the end of the panel discussion. We encourage you to please submit your questions, as this event, as originally planned, was meant to be an interactive discussion. After the presentation, you'll receive a post-event evaluation via email. We encourage you to provide feedback to help shape future SSP programming, and we will also be sending a link to the recording of this event. Before I introduce you to our keynote speaker, who will be followed by a moderated panel presentation, we'd like to launch a poll about some of the various publishing models that we'll be presenting today. Okay, so you should see a poll on your screen, and I'll give everyone a few seconds to answer. Okay. Looks like almost everyone has voted. And here are our results. So thanks for that. It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Lisa Janicki Hinchliff. Lisa is professor as well as coordinator for information literary services and instruction in the university library, an affiliate professor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her responsibilities encompass instruction programs for library users and professional development for library staff and faculty, as well as campus outreach and collaborations related to teaching and learning. She is past president of the Association of College and Research Libraries and currently serves on the board here at SSP. She is also a chef at the Scholarly Kitchen, where she posts frequently on new publishing models and transformative agreements. And with that, Lisa, I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful, and thank you, Mary Beth. Hopefully you are hearing me and get confirmation of that before we go forward.
Yes, I hear you, thanks.
Excellent. So if we could go to the next slide, Mary Beth. Mary Beth already shared with you a little bit about my background, and I want to just fill in a few other things that bring me here. My entire career as an academic librarian, I've also been a faculty member at a community college in the United States, a comprehensive university, and now a research university. So I approach and understand these issues of publishing from not only that perspective of librarian, but also as faculty member. When I was president of the College of Research Association of College and Research Libraries in 2010, we flipped our subscription journal to a platinum diamond open access model. And so I have that experience of being in a society making that difficult but ultimately right decision. I'm also the editor of a journal at the moment right now, Library Trends, which is a special issue only journal. We take no direct submissions. It's published by Johns Hopkins University Press, and we have a 2-year delayed open reading in the Illinois Institutional Repository that is called Ideals, maintaining our subscriptions while also able to open as much content as possible. And then, as Mary Beth said, I write for the Scholarly Kitchen. Oh, go ahead to the next slide. We're so in sync there. I want to do a brief history of library subscriptions because one of the things I've come to realize is that not everyone who is involved in publishing at this moment in time always realizes how libraries have historically gotten the content. And this historical review is very important for understanding the business models that we're seeing today, because I personally believe that the business models that we're seeing today primarily reflect the business models of the past as we attempt to transition, rather than an attempt to create from anew. There are, of course, some exceptions to this. So in the print world, we subscribed to things, and a subscription meant a purchase. You actually owned the copy of the journal that appeared in your mailbox. It was physical, tangible, etc. We sometimes subscribe to these direct from the publisher, but we also subscribe to them via a subscription agency. There were a number of different companies that were very successful in basically managing and mediating subscriptions for libraries so that we wouldn't have to, say at my own institution with 20,000 active subscriptions at that time, be contacting publishers individually for each of them. As the world became digital, we moved to digital subscriptions, which are sometimes purchased, but mostly they are licensed. They are, if you will, a rental. In this model, there may also be a purchase, but then an ongoing maintenance fee. So it's maybe a purchase with a fee to maintain, or sometimes it's just a license, which means it's a rental. The most common of these packages that sort of emerge that really kind of mirror in some ways the subscription agency, but are different in significant ways, is the publisher title packages. These title packages came to us via the largest of publishers in most cases, and they became known as, quote, the big deal, where you got essentially everything from a given publisher, or perhaps there were subset collections. But no longer were we selecting title by title. It's a little bit like subscribing to your cable package. Maybe you only want the comedy and the drama channels, but you get the sports channels along with them as well. We also in the digital world have content via platforms or aggregators, and those are platforms such as Muse or EBSCO. These in some ways are the predecessor, or those that come after the subscription agency, where they bring together content from multiple publishers onto one platform for easy subscription by a library. So the publisher big deals are in some ways like the subscription agency, except they're only a single publisher. And that, of course, meant that the larger the publisher was, the more content they had to offer, the bigger the deal in the sense of both discounts, as well as the proportion of library budgets that were taken up. Subscriptions, I'd like to say and remind you, are a payment to read. Whether they were paying to read in the print era or in the digital era, it's a payment to read. An effect of this is that libraries would seek out, to the degree that they could, given the big deal arrangement, quality in the fields that they collected. The effect was that libraries had a role that was not always recognized of essentially, by our spending, weeding out, if you will, or identifying quality materials. And by that, I don't mean just things like the GIF or other sort of citation metrics, but also the fact that by and large, we just didn't buy things that weren't at least meeting minimal quality. And so as a result, those things went out of business because we didn't buy them in order for people to read them. So there is a lot of question because was that model sustainable? Yes, no, maybe, depends who you are. And that's what we'll unpack a little bit now. Next slide, Mary Beth. So one thing that I think is very interesting is that in 2001, there was an event held at the American Library Association midwinter meeting in which there were 3 papers given, and 2 of those papers implored librarians to please do not purchase the big deal. So here is Mary Case, then at the Association of Research Libraries, writing in her Trends and Issues in the Implications of Aggregate Subscriptions to Electronic Journals, published this was an event sponsored by EBSCO. I might remind you that EBSCO was a subscription agency, and so perhaps they were a little bit concerned about the big deal where libraries were moved to buying directly from the publishers. So Mary Case writes, publishers are vying to control the desktop of the user. The electronic environment offers new opportunities for publishers to enhance market share and control. If larger proportions... Mary Beth, are you not hearing me?
I can hear you. I'll just ask all the other speakers, just make sure you're on mute.
Okay, I was hearing some background noise, so I wasn't quite sure what was happening.
Go ahead.
Okay. All right, great. Excuse me. If larger proportions of library collections budgets go to fewer publishers, will the community be able to abstain publications from publishers who are in fact doing what libraries have asked them to do, keeping their prices reasonable? It would be truly unfortunate if libraries inadvertently undermine the ability to support long-term system-wide change by focusing decision-making on... Hello all.
Great. Welcome back. Okay, looks like we lost Lisa. Let's just give her a second to see if she can rejoin us.
Hello.
Hi,
be
Lisa.
back.
Yes, you're back. Thank you.
I got the most strange message. I got a message on my screen that I have been dismissed from this webinar, and I thought, well, my.
I assure you, you have not been dismissed.
So here we are. We're making the best of it in this brave new world here. Okay. So the point here is Mary Case in 2001 is warning us, and I think as I read this piece 2 years ago, I was astonished by the Cassandra nature of her remarks. Everything she suggested was in danger is exactly what we have seen happen. And libraries are now dealing with, if you will, the fallout of this. Mary Case was joined in this session, as we'll see on the next slide, by Kenneth Frazier, also talking about the librarian's dilemma. And he revised his paper from that EBSCO event and published it in DLib magazine, where he basically point blank said, academic library directors should not sign on to the big deal or any comprehensive licensing agreements with commercial publishers. Now I want to be really clear. Obviously, these two slides came from the perspective of the academic research library. The big deal has been very sustainable for a number of publishers. It has enabled them in many cases not only to be profitable, but also to capitalize and recapitalize their platforms in many ways. And it is no doubt the case that users have benefited from the digital distribution of this content. But I think in these words that we see here, including what it says about what could happen to smaller publishers and what indeed we have seen has happened, we also can see some pre-warnings of things that we might want to be thinking about with the decisions that we are making today when we come to things like transformative agreements and the like. So let's look at what happens the next year. So as a reminder, this seminar happened in 2001. This was prior to the Budapest Open Access Initiative. So Mary Beth, if you could move us forward. Now, I put this up here because I find that, again, people who are coming into publishing more recently, it turns out 2001 was quite a while ago. And so I've had a number of conversations with people who feel like open access happened like last year with Plan S or 2 years ago, or maybe 5 years ago when they first started hearing about APCs in their field. And they really lack the notion that this is a 2-decade movement at this point. So I think it's sort of humorous even to read this document now, and it's talking about the internet as a new technology and pointing out that there's this great public good that is possible if we could remove the access barriers and share information across our globe, across boundaries, etc. Now, in this next slide, we also need this very important piece that a number of you will be familiar with, but that it lays out a definition of open access, which we didn't have a color or a gem or a precious metal to describe at the time. But it says that by open access to this literature, we mean free availability on the public internet. That's an interesting phrase, public internet, permitting any users to read, download, copy, distribute, print, search, or link, crawl them for indexing, pass them as data, use them for any other lawful purpose, without financial, legal, or technical barriers other than those inseparable from gaining internet to the access itself. So I think this is a very interesting part of this, which is I think we would say now that what this means is that at the article level, we should see something that is gold, open access. But I think there's also some very interesting assumptions built into this that somehow or another the public internet and getting access to it would be a barrier that we would overcome fairly quickly. And I'm thinking of our colleagues around the world where perhaps access to the public internet is not so free in the sense not only of cost, but also academic and intellectual freedom. And I'm reading stories like people taking trains for an hour to get outside of Kashmir or some other area where the internet is being restricted so that they can actually study. And it raises a lot of questions, I think, about the equity even in this grand vision. I also will point out that we didn't have Creative Commons licenses at the time in 2002, but there's a description here of what the role of copyright is. And the role of copyright in this domain is control over the integrity of their work and the right to be properly acknowledged and cited. What does control over the integrity of their work mean? Well, this is certainly something that we're seeing challenged and discussed quite a bit now. So let's talk a little bit about open access as it's typically discussed. And this is, of course, nerve-wracking to even present because we know that these sorts of things are seen as different ways, but this is my attempt to synthesize onto a single slide what we mean by article level open access. So at article level open access, we would call it gold if the article is open, if the version of record, the published version, is openly available at a minimum for reading. Other people might also want it to mean other things besides reading, but at a minimum, it would be open for reading, which should typically involve download, print, and the like. The way this happens is typically immediately via an article processing charge or some other payment or subsidy. And if it is an article processing charge, that is either paid by or on behalf of the author. And what we see in transformative agreements is the attempt to increase the number of article level gold open access articles. There's another type that's been discussed in the literature of green. Green may or may not be the final published version of record. It may or may not be available on the publisher platform. It's typically seen as being made available via deposit in some sort of open repository, typically an institutional repository. The green category is much more complicated to describe because there's any number of things that can happen, including sometimes people would say that if the version of record becomes open at some time in the future post it being published subscription, that copy might be considered green. So it's a very difficult category to describe. Green may be subject to embargo. When the publisher is converting something, obviously that would be an embargo of a type, but more likely perhaps the author accepted manuscript or the like can be deposited in a repository, but not for a certain number of months. Say 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. We see any number of times in the various publisher contracts. Now there's the last category here of open access. Not everyone concludes is open access. It is freed by publisher policy or practice. So we are seeing an immense amount of bronze open access right now, and that would be every single one of the COVID-19 portals that are being opened up as the publishers seek to make a contribution to the easy, frictionless flow of knowledge in order to address this global pandemic. We have seen this in the past with SARS, Ebola, any number of other kinds of crises, typically related to health. However, we also have seen publishers in social sciences that have put up portals related to democracy and other issues that are challenging our societies. Bronze open access, freed by publisher policy or practice, may be temporary or it may be continuous. So the other thing that goes in this category is many journals that are subscription have a sample issue that is open so that people can see what the kinds of articles are typically published in this journal. So you can see as well that there could be a little overlap between green and bronze in the sense that if the publisher by policy opens something on their platform, we might consider that a green, even though it is also sort of not under any sort of obligation to stay open. We'll also point out that most publishers seem to be opening their COVID literature on a secondary platform, which means that in many cases, the bronze open access does not get really swept up and counted because we don't see it on the publisher platform. So a couple things that we'll see on this when Mary Beth clicks here for me. Is that we need to be thinking about two things here. First is that every article has ultimately a version of record and then all the other versions. So what is being made open? The version of record, that's what's opened in gold. In green, it might be the version of record, but it might be some other version. The most important version of which in this current policy arena is the author-accepted manuscript version. But of course, there are many versions before the author-accepted manuscript version. Those of us who are faculty and maybe not following the best file naming conventions all have seen that folder we have that's like final version, final version, final version with revisions, final version, no, really it's the final version. But regardless, there's a lot of versions beforehand. The other consideration that we'll need to bring into this discussion, and I just want to make us alert to language, Mary Beth, please click, is the notion of gratis versus libre, which is how this is discussed in the literature. Gratis is literature that is free to access. In other words, you can read it. Typically, you can also download it, print it, copy and paste from it. But ultimately, it is not any more usable to you than a copy that you would have gotten under a subscription. In contrast, and this harkens back to the Budapest Open Access Initiative, is the libre type, which is not just free to access, but is free to reuse. These are rights that we typically don't see on subscription articles, and so this libre open access goes beyond even what one gets if one is a subscriber, or if one is just getting free access, to the ability to remix in different ways, to perhaps even republish in certain cases that same content, that same article in another setting. So what I would point out on this next slide is that almost all journals offer at least one, if not more, of these at the article level. And so now let's take it to the journal level. Mary Beth? At the journal level, we see that there are a great variety of types of open access descriptors that can be applied at the journal level. And those come from the way that they treat the article level open access. So the first category, I guess technically there should be a category here, although it would be non-open access, of pure subscription. But I will point out there is almost no pure subscription journals left. Even journals that do not currently have any open access articles typically have a process for having an open access article. It's just no one's taken them up on it yet. But there are a few. So the next category, or the first category we have of the journal level open access, is the hybrid journal. The hybrid journal is a subscription journal. It still has people who must pay to read the articles that appear under the subscription side, the paywalled side content. But it creates an option within its policy as well as a payment mechanism for gold articles funded by APCs or some other payment. Now, these hybrid journals were initially created and seen as the hope of being a transition process for transitioning, that eventually so many articles would just be published, paid with APCs, that there would be nothing left to subscribe to. There are a few journals out there in the world where that is indeed the case, but there are very few. And what this also does not take into account is the non-research article content that is in almost every subscription journal. That content that is not considered, under the realm of what most open access policies are looking to affect. And so it's possible that even all the research articles are being published open, but there is additional content that is still under the subscription model. We have become perhaps most familiar with the challenges and the views on hybrid journals with Plan S, and it's sort of saying that there will be no hybrid journals that are funded payment for. Of course, we also know that transformative agreements, especially for Plan S, rehabilitate the hybrid journal back into acceptability. The next category is the gold open access journal. In a gold open access journal, all the articles are gold open. There's no content to subscribe to. And again, it is typically funded by APCs or some other payment model that is still operating on the article level. Continuing our kind of going forward with the precious metals, but then we also got a gemstone in here. There's the platinum or diamond open access journal, where all the articles are gold open, but there are no APCs. So there are no fees to read, and there are no fees to publish. In typical cases, we'll see this as institutionally sponsored or somehow or another otherwise sponsored. So I mentioned at the beginning that College and Research Libraries is a platinum or diamond open access journal. The way that we do that is we take money that the society takes in from other funding, other revenue sources, and use it to pay for the cost of publishing that journal. That is perhaps an option available to a society, maybe less so to a publisher alone. Next slide, Mary Beth. So there are a lot of levers and catalysts for open access, and I just wanted to sort of put them up here as a collective to say that we see mandates and policies. And of course, we're seeing any number of those coming forward at institutional, governmental, funder, and society, scholarly society levels, where people say either you should publish open access, sort of an exhortation, or a mandate in order to create actual open access content. So for example, at my campus, if I publish an article and it is not published open access, I am mandated to make a version of it available in our open access repository unless I apply for a waiver. We also see communities of practice working on this in different areas. We're familiar with things like coalitions, like OA 2020, the 2.5% initiative. We, of course, are all perhaps overly familiar these days with Plan S and a coalition of funders, but we also have knowledge sharing and networking. There are a lot of levers and catalysts working in this area. So let's move on then, having laid the groundwork, to actually talking about the models that we might have available to us. These are, in my sort of attempt to, again, sort of synthesize everything that's happening onto one slide into a landscape of models. We'll talk a little bit more about transformative agreements in a second, but I would particularly point out to you that we see the emergence of two modes, read and publish and read. I personally see some important distinctions between these two. I know others who feel that that's just semantics, so we could talk about that at some point. We're also seeing various iterations on a theme with add-ons like SAGE and UNC Chapel Hill and their rebate program. We see the American Physiological Society doing society memberships for authors. There's all sorts of things. More recently, we're seeing libraries sign on to what are coming to be known as the pure publish agreements. These are like a transformative agreement, except there's nothing to transform because these journals didn't ever publish anything under subscription, but it's still perhaps a way of purchasing, if you will, the ability to publish in a bulk way so that all an institution's authors can publish and perhaps also negotiate some sort of discount or additional information that the library might be interested in. We've no doubt seen the success with the anthropology journals and now annual reviews in the subscribe to open model, where libraries that were subscribers continue to subscribe, but saying that because we all agree to continue to subscribe in our subscription mode, the publisher commits that if enough people continue, the content will be open for all. But if people don't subscribe, the content will not be open, which means that if it's important enough to you to subscribe, you probably need to subscribe, otherwise you will lose access. So it's a way of handling the collective action problem. We see also various library partnerships and institutional membership models, and I'm really glad we have Martin Paul Eve here today to talk about the Open Library of Humanities and some other smaller, so we see that, and we see other kinds of projects in that space, where sort of libraries throw in, if you will, perhaps for the benefit of being a partner in this, perhaps there's some additional governance opportunities, but there's a partnership or membership model. And then, of course, we do see funder investments. Like we see the F1000 platform being used for certain grantees. And we also see funder investments in platforms more generally, often those that then evolve into either a pure publish, a subscribe to open, or a library partnership model. So there might be some sort of seed funding, if you will. So let's look at the next slide, because I want to talk about transformative agreements in greater detail. Transformative agreements are currently the primary large-scale mechanism we have for converting subscription journals into an increased percentage of their content being published open. It does not necessarily mean that journals are, quote, flipping because of this, because the number of subscribers there are still to the content that is subscription-based, but it is the primary mechanism we see libraries using and then publishers also responding to say that this is how we can have more open access publishing paid for by institutions on behalf of authors, perhaps with an institutional backend of grant money flowing into the Transformative Agreement, perhaps not, in order to see more open access publishing. In Read and Publish, the articles are, the payment is in two parts, a reading part and a publishing part. In Publish and Read, all the payment is on the publish side and reading comes for free. So let's look back to the original big deal for a second on the next slide, which is where libraries purchased all the electronic access to a commercial publisher's journals for a price. That price was based on historic spend at that point, typically plus some increment. So whatever publishers were getting the dominant percentage of library budgets at that time, then received the dominant proportion of library budgets in the digital era. In theory, we were allowed to cancel paper subscriptions. Sometimes we even actually bought additional paper copies, which is a little puzzling to me, but let's leave that aside. But the content became bundled. You really couldn't cancel any particular journal. So I'm going to put forward to you on this next slide and in the piece I wrote on the Scholarly Kitchen that transformative agreements are best understood as the new big deal. It shifts the contracted payment, typically with a big deal contract, from the library paying the publisher for reading to the library paying the publisher for publishing. It is the big deal, but with something else purchased. Now, one thing I want to point out is that what's transformed in a transformative agreement is actually the library budget. It is the object that the library is spending on. It is going to typically the same publisher that the money was going to before. So if you are that publisher, this is a highly sustainable, attractive approach, obviously. If you are not that publisher, then this continues to be difficult for smaller and independent publishers to get the attention of libraries. So Mary Beth, next slide, which I actually put the definition of read and publish and read, so we can look at that. There's a citation now. We'll just go on. I already said it. I forgot. So I want to just point out a few issues with what's happening and the question of sustainability. And I acknowledge that it's totally the case in this perspective of where you stand depends on how sustainable this shift and these transitions are. I'm not entirely confident these are going to be any more sustainable for academic and research libraries than the big deal was for academic and research libraries. I would typically have told you there is no more money for libraries, and now with the pandemic and the economic fallout from that, I can assure you there is not going to be a massive infusion of cash into academic and research libraries. So sustainability is a very interesting question right now. So I want to point out a couple issues. There's the industry landscape, and I highly recommend that you read Roger Schoenfeld's pieces where he talks about crowning the OA royalty. And again, this question of how our monies are prioritizing publishers, certain publishers over other publishers, and the potential there is for a further consolidating market, where the small and independent publishers either get acquired or they become sort of subsidiary and beholden through contracts that Michael Clark writes a lot about with the publisher agreements. There's also this question of lock-in. It's a prestige goods market at the moment, in my mind. The APC price studies really bear this out, which say that APC prices are certainly affected by prestige. And I think the library position in negotiations is going to be really challenging in next round, because if we thought it was hard to cancel a journal that faculty like to read, I'm really wondering how it's going to work when a library tries to cancel a transformative agreement and no longer pay for publishing in a particular journal where their faculty like to publish. That does not seem to me that it is going to be a pleasant moment for libraries at all. if what we have to do is to say that we can no longer support publishing in the way that historically we've even struggled when we've had to say, we're sorry, we can't support reading in this journal anymore. Because with reading, we could at least use interlibrary loans, get you another copy, we had other options. There is no interlibrary loan equivalent for the Transformative Agreement and APCs. There's also some interesting questions around author perspectives. There's some strange stuff going on that we see that even when publishers set the default to OA under Transformative Agreements, authors are opting out. They're actually resetting their article to closed. And this is particularly puzzling and sort of a little bit disappointing in cases where the contracts are such, like in publish and read, that the library must pay the publish and read fee for that article, even if the author reverts it to closed. So this is a structure question in these contracts. There's also questions of academic freedom. We know there's at least one, if not more, lawsuits going on in Germany, for example, around these kinds of mandates. And then, of course, mandates come with their own issues of implementation challenges, like how do you monitor them? Are there any penalties for non-compliance? And, of course, the ever-popular unfunded mandates, which make it even more difficult to do any sort of compliance checking and holding people to account. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. I have indeed managed to leave a few minutes for questions, even with our little technical issue. So there is a questions box in your control panel for this webinar, and we'd welcome you to offer any questions. I'm going to go ahead and pop out. It looks like maybe something is here. So it looks like somebody, so I think, so the question is, do I think that subscription to open deals are sustainable? In other words, transformative agreements, that institutions will continue to pay for open, and will there be similar consolidation threats with this model? So I absolutely believe there are consolidation threats. If I were, well, I do run a small journal. So there's no doubt that there are consolidation threats here. Of course, there will potentially be benefits to independent and smaller society publishers if they are able to join up with a larger platform, but those benefits may not be financial. In fact, they probably will not be financial, but I also don't know that there's an option. So whether they're sustainable on the library side, I think is also a really interesting question. Scott, I think, will have something to say about this with the model with ACS, which requires that, point blank, certain libraries and the institutions have to pay a lot more in order for that model to work, because who publishes and who reads are not distributed in the same way. And in fact, that's the whole point of open access, is that that reading gets universally distributed. But if you pay for it in a less distributed way of publishing, then certain institutions have to pay more. So how do I see academia.edu fitting into the landscape at the moment? And I'm going to include ResearchGate in that. So it's without a doubt that both of those platforms have incredible effect and platform effect on where scholars are doing their work, looking for literature, connecting with folks. Obviously, to the degree that that is a piracy mechanism, I don't think authors really see themselves as pirating. I think they see themselves as sharing with their community. Completely understand that that's probably not totally in keeping with the contracts that they signed. But I think even with these other platforms, as we move to open access, one of the questions that's going to be facing publishers is there's still value to having content on the publisher platform itself. And so if your content by copyright can migrate off your platform, you no longer have the ability, for example, to use that content in order to solicit authors because they're reading in a particular area, or give analytics back to those who are funding your open access. And so there's a lot more platform effects here just than the question of copyright on the content. So that's I think a bigger issue there on academia and ResearchGate, beyond even I think the one that we see most publishers really thinking a lot about, which is, of course, the piracy question, which is not an insignificant question, or the unauthorized sharing is maybe the better way to put it than piracy. I'd love to, I believe that there'll be a place in the market for subscribed journals, especially for small and independent publishers who are for the moment too small to transform. Sure. Is it a big enough place in order to be financially viable? That's not clear to me. I think in some niche, very prestigious niche areas, yes. But the more content that is open access, the more difficult it is going to be to maintain that, including, authors are just going to be under mandates that they have to do something open. On top of which is, that which shall be not named with publishers. The reality is, even if you are publishing a subscription journal, all of your content is available on Sci-Hub. I have publishers tell me they know it's available within 24 hours of publishing it. So it would be best to think about this as your content is open, who is controlling it? Oh, let's see. I have no idea what the percentage reduction in library budgets will be. I can tell you that the state of Illinois released its budget predictions. This is the state of Illinois, and they are saying that a conservative estimate is the state will have 20% less income in the coming year than had been projected. So there is no way that will not reverberate to our universities and thus to our libraries. I do not know what we will be doing. It's difficult because obviously we weren't planning this to be about, sustainability in a pandemic, and we just really don't know right now. I'm not even sure what researchers are aware of at this point either, so it's a little bit difficult to say. All right, I think I have time to take one more question here. Let me just browse. There's so many here. Okay, let's see. Do you believe that many publishers, particularly societies, are piloting transformative agreements with specific consortia or institutions before rolling out a model? I think that those pilots essentially become a public model, whether you intend them to be or not. So I would advise personally that if you are piloting something, to assume that you can put pilot on it, but other libraries are going to expect, or at least think, that they're going to be able to get that same model. And let me pair this with, on the publisher side, there's a question of like, well, what's the option, right? I think we'll definitely see a transition as well to not just publishing. Roger Schoenfeld's certainly written about this when he talks about the pivot to being workflow for many of the large publishers. I've written about this with the respect to things like, if we look at specifically Elsevier and the vertical stack that they're building, that I still remember being in a session in the early 2010 or something, where Elsevier Hunter Forum said, we intend to support the scholar from the beginning of the career till the end at all phases of scholarship. And I see that happening across a lot of other publishers as well. So what this will mean for whether libraries can support all these different models, there's a lot of different funding sources. None of those funding sources are particularly robust. So I think that we are really smart to be having a webinar today on sustainability, and I can't wait for you to hear from our panelists about the ways that they at least have approached this sustainability question in their own institutions, their own organizations, and how they're thinking through some of these issues. So thank you so much, and I'll be back at the end with the collective Q&A, but for now I get to turn myself into listen mode. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. I'd like now to move on to our moderated panel discussion, which is led by Heather Rowland-Staines. She is the head of partnerships for the Knowledge Futures Group, building open source software for publishers, libraries, and researchers. She's worked in scholarly communications for the last 2 decades, including stints at Hypothesis, Springer Nature, and Greenwood Publishing Group. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Heather.
Thanks so much, Mary Beth. I'm really excited to be here today to bring you this session. Who would have thought that discussion of transformative agreements and alternative models would be a nice diversion from our daily life? But I'm happy that's happening. As Mary Beth mentioned, we have 4 panelists with us today. The way that we have planned the session, each panelist will give a little brief 5-minute or so intro and overview to their experience in creating, supporting, and enabling transformative and alternative models. And then I'll have a few questions for them and we'll open it up for your questions. And as Lisa said, she's welcome to take questions during that time as well. We have 4 speakers today. Unfortunately, Yasmin Langa from Brill is under the weather, but improving. So we look forward to having her back participating in an event at a later date. So our first speaker will be Scott Delman. I'm going to introduce everyone now so I don't have to interrupt them. Scott is the Director of Publications for the Association for Computing Machinery, the world's leading professional member organization for researchers, practitioners, and students working at the forefront of the computing and technology industries. Second up is Stephen Hall. Stephen is Managing Director of IOP Publishing. He's worked in academic publishing since 1978, holding senior positions at Chadwick Healy, ProQuest, Blackwell, and Wiley Blackwell before he joined IOP Publishing in 2010. Third will be Ruth Harrison. Ruth is Head of Scholarly Communications Management at Imperial College in London, and she's responsible there for the strategic management of the library services education and research support programs, both for students and staff across the college campuses. And rounding things out for us is Martin Paul Eve. Martin is a British academic and writer. He's Professor of Literature, Technology, and Publishing at Birkbeck College, University of London, and Visiting Professor of Digital Humanities at Sheffield Hallam University. And as been mentioned, Martin is going to be holding up the end for the humanities side of the equation. So that's one of the reasons why he's kind of batting cleanup here. So we're looking forward to him rounding out the STM and STM library oriented conversations. So with that, I will hand things over to Scott.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you, Lisa, for your great keynote. Actually, lots of interesting information in that keynote that is really relevant to our situation as a learned society. For those of you not familiar with ACM, we're a roughly 70-year-old society focused on the field of computing, publishing computer science literature. We're also a very large conference organizer, running about 200 conferences annually. And so obviously with the current pandemic, we're feeling a lot of the impact of the social distancing. What I'm going to do over the next 4.5 to 5 minutes is talk you through a little bit of the history, and then I'm going to throw a lot of data at you. And actually we've picked out just a couple of slides with some data that is really the tip of the iceberg. And I'm happy to share all of the other data with you, offline. If people want to reach out to me, I'm happy to do that. Let me take a step back before we get into the data that's in front of you. Actually, if you can just go back to the beginning slide, Heather. Before I actually start throwing that data, I want to just talk very briefly about the history of ACM and open access. What I see is many societies and publishers reacting recently to government mandates, and whether that's Plan S in Europe, whether that's OSTP, public access mandates in the United States or elsewhere. ACM is, of course, cognizant of those mandates, and we want to make sure that all of our authors are compliant. But that's not really what drives us. As a 501c3 corporation, a mission-based nonprofit, we are driven by our membership, which as of today is about 100,000 computer scientists and students around the world. And we're driven by the data. And more than any other message that I want to convey during these moments is how important a publisher's data is to determining the right model for that publisher, whether it's a nonprofit society or a for-profit commercial publisher. We launched hybrid open access back in 2013. Even before that, we set our publications policies as green open access, so any ACM author can certainly upload their articles, the accepted manuscript version of their articles, to archive or any institutional repository with no embargo. So for ACM, it's really about serving the author, it's about serving the field more than it is responding to government mandates. So for that, it's a given. We launched back in 2013 hybrid, and over the last 6 years or so, 7 years, we've gotten to about 5% of our submissions per year are now published on an APC, author selected, author opt-in APC model. And our general sense about a year ago when we looked at that data was that it's just not moving fast enough. There's a lot of pressure coming from the scientific community, from the library community, and also from the data itself that shows the benefit of moving to an OA model as quickly as possible. We're not sure that if we left it to individual authors to opt in and pay APCs that we would ever get there. And so that was really the main impetus for us developing an institutional model. Currently, about 5% is APCs. And about a year ago, we started working, a little over a year, we started working with a group of universities and consortia, California Digital Library, with all of the UC schools, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, the University of Minnesota, and Iowa State. And we decided to work together to see if we could find a model that was a bit different than what the other publishers were trying out, the big commercial publishers. And through what was really a tremendously collaborative process, about 12 to 18 months long, we settled on this model that I'm going to show you. Heather, now we can go to the first slide with a ton of data. So these numbers, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I want to point out a couple of kind of key data points that were really fundamental to the model that we chose ultimately, that we're calling ACM Open. The first is that we have about 2,700 subscribers that effectively subscribe to ACM's kind of mid-sized deal. We won't call it a big deal, but mid-sized deal. And that generates roughly, back in 2018, about 20 to 21 million on the top line in terms of digital library revenues. And we were publishing back in 2018 about just under 20,000 what we would consider APC eligible or full research papers. Out of that 2,700 institutions, the bottom 1,700 only represent about 20% of the articles that we publish on an annual basis. So as you look at this chart, you look at the rows going across, institutions represent about 80% of the articles we publish every year. And then if you go to the end of that row, you'll see that that same group of 1,000 institutions represents only about a third of the revenue. And that dynamic and that trend gets more and more extreme the further up you go. Top 250 represent about half of what we publish every year, but only 11% of the revenue. And then, of course, at the most extreme end, the top 100 represent about a third of the articles we publish every year, but only 5% of the revenue. So when you look at this and you consider what the implications would be of moving to a completely open access, essentially pay for publish model, there has to be an enormous rebalancing. And that was probably more than anything else one of the key drivers for the model that we chose. You can go to the next slide. And when I show the model in a moment, this is the result. This is what the projected result of implementing that model, the ACM Open model, fully would mean. It would essentially shift the burden of payment from that 2,700 institution long tail to about 1,000 universities that represent the vast majority of what we publish every year. And then if you look at the third column and you look at the last column from top to bottom, you see that there's a much more, let's say, even distribution and equitable distribution of publication and revenue. what are the implications of that for individual institutions? It means that some institutions are going to pay the same. Some will pay dramatically less. In fact, the vast majority will pay dramatically less, but some on the very top end, the top, say, 500 institutions, are going to be asked to pay significantly more. Obviously, we know that in the current climate, that's not an easy ask. But the reality is that if we move to a publication model, it only seems fair that the costs of publication come from those institutions where the publications are coming from. Maybe to the next slide. So this is the model itself. We've chosen to move completely away from an APC-driven model. We have a tier-based model, and those tiers are determined, of course, by ranges of publication output. So in our case, the ranges are the average number of articles published by corresponding authors at an institution over the 3 previous years. So we take currently, we take 2017 through 2019 data. We average the number of articles where the corresponding author is at that institution, and that determines that institution's tiering. If you look at an institution like MIT that's joined the ACM Open model, or Carnegie Mellon that's joined the ACM Open model, those are tier 1 institutions that are publishing 150 to 200 plus articles a year. And so while they would be moving to a fairly expensive $100,000 tier in our case, they're also publishing hundreds of articles a year. So on a per article basis, it obviously works out quite a lot less expensive than what you see as a typical APC price. This is the basic model. What we see is on the bottom row, that what we call tier 10 is comprised of those roughly 16 to 1,700 institutions that are effectively read-only. They're not publishing with ACM, and when they do publish, it's maybe one article every couple of years. Those institutions over time are going to need their pricing to either come down dramatically, so we've implemented essentially a ramp down in pricing, or those institutions are going to end up canceling. And so that it's red because it's a total unknown at this point. Our focus is really on migrating those top 1,000 institutions, what we're calling today tiers 1 through 9, over to this model. And then to the last slide. And it's a little bit blurry, but what you can see is on the left side, you see institutions. Those with a check mark next to them are those institutions that have already committed to a 3-year agreement with ACM for ACM Open. And on the right side, you see consortia that we're working with around the world. Ireland just joined last week. We're about to sign an agreement with Scotland. We know Max Planck is about to join in the coming weeks. And lots of large research institutions around the world have expressed strong interest in joining. Yes, what we're calling a pilot today, but effectively we believe, at this point, we believe that this is the model for us going forward. What's important to point out, if you could just go back one slide for a second, Heather, is the unlimited publication aspect of this model. Once an institution is tiered, they enter into a 3-year, 4-year, or 5-year agreement, and during the term of that agreement, they're locked into that tier. There are no additional prices. That tier price covers an unlimited number of open access articles being published affiliated with that institution. There are lots of other aspects of the model. I'm happy to answer questions during Q&A, but those are kind of the fundamentals. One comment before we hand over to the next panelist on sustainability. For those sort of top tier institutions, the ones that are probably in tiers 1 through 5 on this chart, we are asking them to pay significantly more money than they pay today. Many of them pay between $5,000 and $10,000 a year for our big deal, the read-only licenses. We don't believe fundamentally that the transition to open access through transformative agreements will work globally unless libraries are able to tap into some other larger source of funding. If you're only working from the library funds, we don't think that our model long-term, 10 years, 20 years or longer, is sustainable for institutions. At some point, the universities are going to have to figure out how to tap into research grants at those universities. When we look at the number of research grants at the tier 1 through 9 levels that those faculty members are getting, there is ample money to support these publication costs. But we understand it's going to take time. It's going to take a rebalancing of budgets, the ability for universities to tap into those grants somehow with overheads. But in general, for ACM, we see this as the model. We've had extremely positive feedback, and we expect somewhere between 5 to 7 years to be the sort of time frame for a full flip.
Thanks, Scott. We'll go on to Stephen's first slide.
Hello, everyone. Just a bit of context, and coming back to Lisa's point about when open access started, we launched our first open access journal in 1998. It's still going strong, predating the Budapest announcement and any Berlin meetings. And a bit broader context, in 2019, around 11% of the 30,000 articles that we published were open access. The rest were subscription. So I thought I'd start with a quick overview, a reminder of the 3 routes to open access that Plan S envisages. So the first one, the obvious one, publication in an open access journal or an open access platform. The second being essentially the green route to OA, with the deposit of the version of record or the accepted manuscript in a repository immediately on publication under a CC BY license. And the third one being publication on an open access basis in a subscription journal under a transformative arrangement in Plan S terms. If we can move to the second slide, I'll start to talk about those 3 models. So of the 3 routes, we believe that 2 are sustainable. The first being publication in an open access journal or an open access platform. And the second, which I'll talk about on my third slide in a minute in a bit more detail, being publication on an OA basis in a subscription journal under a transformative arrangement or agreement. However, we think the third model, the immediate deposit in a repository under CC BY, is not sustainable. A very significant part of a publisher's investment in getting an article to the AA is in getting the article to the accepted manuscript stage. We've been analyzing in considerable detail our publishing costs for about the last 5 years to understand in which parts of the process those costs lie. And we're also a participant in the Coalition S pricing transparency exercise that's going on at the moment, though it's really about cost transparency rather than price transparency. And what our submission to that exercise shows is that 49% of our cost is in getting an article to the AM stage. That's essentially in the management of the journals that authors want to submit to, the management of peer review, and our costs here are probably a bit higher than most other publishers because we manage the peer review process itself through our own staff. We have 70 people working in our publishing operations department who do nothing but manage peer review. And then also in the technology costs that go to support submissions and so on, and in the overheads that are associated with all of those people working in those teams. If all accepted manuscripts are made immediately available under CC BY, that will inevitably lead to a significant loss of subscription revenues, which themselves pay for the peer review and journal development. And we just don't see how that is sustainable. Green open access relies on the subscriptions being maintained to pay the costs of publication, and immediate deposit in a repository under a license which would allow anyone else to reuse that content would completely undermine the economic sustainability of journals publishing. But on top of that, I think it's morally wrong. It would be an appropriation of that very significant investment that we've made in getting an article to the accepted manuscript stage. I think publishers are a little bit to blame for this. We've never really talked publicly about where our costs lie, and clearly there's an urgent need to do that now. If we can move on to the third slide, Heather. I'll talk a bit about transformative agreements. And again, a bit of background here. We currently have 11 transformative agreements in place, mostly in Europe. We've had some of those agreements in the form of offsetting agreements in place since 2014. We made the first offsetting agreements in Austria and the UK in that year. So we've got a fair bit of experience of them. And those 11 agreements that we have now are a mixture of offsetting agreements, read and publish and read. And our view, at least for a publisher of our size, which is able to negotiate and manage agreements of this size, of this kind, is that they can lead to full open access publication at the local level, whether that's a single institution or a consortium or nationally. Our agreement in Austria is very close to 100% OA of Austrian authors, thanks to what is a very close cooperation between us as the publisher, the Austrian University Library Consortium, and the main Austrian funder. In our experience, these agreements work best when all three stakeholders are involved in these agreements, and it's not just a funder asking universities and publishers to work it out between themselves. I'd also make the point that there can't be a one-size-fits-all transformative agreement. If you're a university paying a high license fee but publishing relatively little, or you're a university paying a low license fee but publishing a lot, and we have some of those customers, then the costs of these agreements are likely to fall on you differently. And more generally, I expect more agreements to be read and publish than publish and read, essentially being transformative of local output and not necessarily changing the whole business model. And I say that because of the reasons that Scott has just set out, the winners and losers issue, as I call it. In any transition to a global open access system, there are going to be very significant winners and losers. They'll be both within any one country, because the number of research-intensive institutions is going to be smaller than the number of teaching-intensive institutions, and the costs will fall much more heavily on those research-intensive institutions than it will on the others. But it's also a problem at global level. The costs would also need to be distributed very differently between countries than they are today. And I think this issue of winners and losers is the single biggest impediment to any kind of transition to a fully open model. It's not mentioned at all anywhere in Plan S's statements, and it's little mentioned by individual funders either. And it seems to me that's the problem we'll have to solve if we're really going to make these agreements work and move from read and publish to publish and read over the longer term. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. And next up again is Ruth Harrison.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can.
So, excellent. I don't have slides full of data, so for the data fans out there, apologies. A bit of context, I won't do the whole Imperial College London slide with a picture and everything, but Imperial is a very research intensive institution, if you're not aware of that. We, by we, I mean our authors, our researchers, publish between 10 and 12,000 outputs a year. The majority of those are journal articles. So clearly, in any discussion of open access publishing, that's very important for us and for our authors, because mandates and policies apply primarily to journal articles and conference papers, but the journal article is still what's most significant. What we've seen at the college over the past few years is, whilst we've had mandates or policies rather from funders in the UK, which has meant that authors have had, if you want to see it that way, to make their work available in open access. We also have an institutional fund to pay for open access, and that pays for APCs in full open access journals only. And we've seen an increase in authors choosing to publish their work on open access. That is in a non-hybrid journal, not a subscription journal. And that is, it seems to be increasing. It's a choice that authors are actually making. So it's not something that they're feeling they're having to do, it's something that they want to do. And in order to support our authors in doing that, a bit of context to my team, we support open access, publishing, research data management, copyright licensing, metrics and impact, yeah, that's almost everything. We also manage information literacy programs. It's a bit of a mixed bag. To support open access, I have a team of 6. There's also technical support for our repository, which is outside the library. In the context, using that word a lot, of the Transformative Agreement, this is now, of course, involving other teams in the library. So we are working much more closely, for example, and I know this is the case at other institutions, with our subscriptions team. There's about 5 staff in our subscriptions team, part of a wider content and discovery team. And they're learning about a lot of this at the same time as a lot of other people, whereas our open access team and myself have been working in this area for quite a long time. And in addition to that, we have other staff within my team and across the library subject liaison teams also supporting all of this. So it's a big operation within libraries. So on to the next slide. So as far as we in the, well, certainly in the library are concerned, we want to make sure that our authors can make their work available on open access. And we have roughly the 2 routes that exist, that is in a journal or by self-archiving. Like I say, we have repository at the college. Clearly, the access to literature at a research intensive, but any university, is incredibly important. So we have those 2 things. We need to make sure that our researchers have access to the literature that they want to read. A lot of that is through subscription, but there are obviously other routes. But that open access publishing component, as I said earlier, is becoming much more important to our authors. And it's not just about the journal article. So those of you who have been following how the UK government has responded to COVID-19 may be aware of Neil Ferguson, who is an Imperial College London researcher. The work that his group are publishing at the moment and making available is not yet in journal article form, but it's really important that that work is made available and it's disseminated quickly, and that is what we are wanting to do. We are in the UK working generally in a consortium model for a lot of our subscriptions, and that's with JISC, where we're looking at transformative agreements. I have my own reservations around transformative agreements, as Lisa's already described. I am particularly concerned that we do not end up in the big deal environment again. So we are looking at other open access publishing models. Because we are research intensive, affordability is obviously very important. Before the current situation, we were already facing very flat budgets. I have no idea what's going to happen now. But as I've said, our researchers are wanting to share their work openly. And in discussions recently around the UKRI Open Access Policy Review, which some people may be aware of, it's become quite clear through our research committee conversations that there's support for author copyright retention when people are publishing. People are starting to understand what it means for them to have control of their copyright in regards to how they can reuse their own work. So on to the last slide. So I had a rough go at perhaps some principles that we would like, I hope, to adopt when we're working with everybody. I would like to say at the moment, green still remains a viable choice for our authors, and it does mean that people can meet open access policy requirements. The zero embargo, obviously, in Plan S means that would happen. I understand, as Stephen's outlined, that there are reservations around that being sustainable. And no, the version of record is the one that people want, not the accepted manuscript, but we are in a transitional stage. So I think we must not forget that it is very important to keep that option open. But we need to be responsible about how we are spending public money. We certainly need to make sure that we continue where we can to enable researchers to publish where they want to. I did not confer with Stephen on this, but I've also written one size does not fit all on this slide. I've been really interested in reading about the different models, hearing about the different models that people are coming up with. We are looking at all of them when they are presented to us. Transformative agreements certainly are not for everybody, and going back again to that danger of the big deal, they cannot be the solution for everything, I don't think. And it's not just a danger, if you like, with transformative agreements, but one of the criteria, shall I say, for inclusion is an emphasis on the corresponding author being identifiable within the institution. In the UK, but I don't think this is unique to us, we want all our authors, whether they're the corresponding author or a co-author, to have the open access option available to them. So we cannot forget those people. And in the UK, because UKRI is signed up to Plan S, and that includes anybody who will be submitting their work to the Research Excellence Framework, the REF exercise, that is all authors. It's not just people with Research Council funding or Wellcome Trust funding. So it's really important that we, as far as I'm concerned, in libraries, ensure that all our authors, if they choose to make their work available in open access, have that option. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, and handing over to Martin.
Okay, thank you very much. I get to close everything off and try to synthesize things, but I'm also coming with a perspective from a different set of disciplinary backgrounds with a different set of economic and academic assumptions behind them. So the publisher that I run, which is a small new publisher founded in 2013 and launched in 2015, is based in the humanities disciplines. It's called the Open Library of Humanities. and it consists of a mega journal called the Open Library of Humanities, that is a transdisciplinary publishing space, and then 27 other journals. We're a not-for-profit organisation, we're a UK registered charity, and we have a collective funding model that I'm going to be talking about today. I guess I wanted first just to backtrack a little bit though onto the economic assumptions that we were operating under when we set this platform up. So the humanities disciplines are traditionally not funded by project-specific grants to the same extent as the natural sciences. This doesn't mean they're not funded. I mean, I get a research day per week in my academic role, nominally anyway, that is funded by QR funding from the REF in the UK and by institutional cross-subsidy from teaching. It's not as though there isn't money in the system that pays my salary while I'm doing research, but it does mean that it's harder to think of the ways in which open access publishing fees could easily be outsourced and delegated to a budget in particular that funds a research project. And that is more extensively the case, I think, in the humanities disciplines than other projects. Your historian needs a day to go to the library per week, does not need expensive lab equipment, does not traditionally have, necessarily have project funding for a particular book, for example. And so when in 2013 we were looking excitedly around for open access models in the humanities, we stumbled across PLOS and liked a lot of what they'd done. But we polled our constituent academics on what an acceptable academic processing, article processing charge would be, and the response was unanimously 0. It was not acceptable to anyone we polled that there was any level of article processing charge. It was quite extraordinary to us. We'd expect people to say, oh, you know, my institution could probably afford £200 or so, what they'd pay for a subscription to a title. But actually, there was a misunderstanding of what an article processing charge represented, the fear of corruption of the peer review process via those types of charges, and in short, an unavailability of budgets. Most of our academics felt they would be laughed out of their dean's office if they went and asked for even minimal amounts of money to enable them to publish open access. So we set about implementing a model that now looks a lot like subsequently Subscribe to Open, but working on the basis of a new publisher. I will talk a little bit about the different challenges that this had when you're starting from scratch as opposed to running with an existing publisher. But the essentials of our model are that members join, members are libraries, they pay us a fee that is less than a single article processing charge at many commercial publishers, and in return they have a governance stake in the platform, but all our material is open access by default. There are no article processing charges, there are no charges to read. Libraries pay on the basis of goodwill for our sustained existence. And it does come down a bit, I guess, to what Lisa was talking about, which is that we try to balance the value proposition of what we offer against our continued existence and the price point. So we aim to be a small publisher. We're not ever aiming to be bigger than we are in some senses. We're a reference model for how you can implement this kind of model. But we charge a low amount. And if libraries at any point feel they can't subscribe anymore and they drop out en masse, we simply can't exist anymore. And at present, we publish around 550 articles a year. So we are definitely a small deal. But in some senses, I think we do hit this problematic territory of also being a big deal in the small deal sense. When you join the Open Library of Humanities, you don't join to support a specific journal, although, for instance, one of our largest journals, Glossa, which was the editorial board from Elsevier's previous journal, Lingua, moving over to start a new title with Ubiquity Press, and we fund that. Many of the libraries support us because their academics are publishing in that title, and they see the others as thrown in. But that's not how it's supposed to operate. It is you're funding us as an organization to have the overhead to continue to exist. So I think of us as a big, small deal. Can I have the next slide, please? So what did we achieve? Well, in in 5 years, we went from 0 to 300 institutions supporting us. The largest institutions pay around $2,500. The smaller ones are less than that. And that allows us to operate a staff base and to publish our 27 journals. I guess the thing that I'd emphasize is that this was an incredible amount of work. We talk often about new business models and how they offer potential routes to salvation for existing publishers. But I'd just stress that the marketing labor involved in implementing new models is absolutely horrendous. This is true that I had a stroke in 2016. I'm only partially joking when I say it was a result of trying to explain to 300 libraries what this new model was supposed to do, why they should support it, and so on. If you have no upfront capital to invest in marketing your new model and explaining it to libraries almost on a one-to-one basis at each point, you're not going to succeed. So it was only because we had support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in the form of an upfront grant that we were really able to conduct this type of marketing labor. Other small society organizations will now not necessarily be able to get that kind of upfront funding. I'd also say that part of the way we've succeeded in this model that relies on the goodwill of libraries in exchange for our goodwill in just being a good open access actor the whole time rests in keeping costs low and eliminating cross subsidies. Now, this is very hard for learned societies who at the moment derive a portion of their revenue from publishing activities. We do not pay editors. We do not pay any society its own costs for subsidizing, say, PhD studentships or other intradisciplinary academic undertakings that learned societies traditionally fund. This makes us in some ways a less attractive publisher for learned societies that want to flip their journals. But on the other hand, we do offer a model of open access that has no fees. And this is something we see societies sort of mentally wrangling with when they decide, is this an organization to whom we should come? We'll lose £30,000 worth of revenue we're getting at the moment from the press, but we'll comply with every open access mandate at the same time without any article processing charges. So to an extent, I think we've been pretty successful in this model. And as I say, Subscribe to Open has a similar premise where essentially libraries pay in so that the thing can continue to be open access. Subscribe to Open has a benefit that we don't have, which is that they can threaten to revert to a subscription model on these titles if libraries don't participate. So they have a lever of already existing that really gives a much stronger bind for libraries to participate. We have not opted to ever go that way. I think we'd rather fold than to abandon our mission and core commitment to open access. But people do often ask me, what's the biggest threat to your organization? And quite simply, it's the thing that's looming over us all today, which is that the global environment is totally beyond our control. If you told me last September that our universities would have closed down, we'd be in isolation from each other in the midst of a global pandemic, and that this would have far-reaching consequences in financial terms for libraries around the world, I would have said, oh, I'm looking forward to that already. We cannot predict what the global environment is like, and we anticipate we might be one of the first things that are cut from a library budget, not because we're bad, but because library budgets are extremely tight and we are small and new. So I don't think it's even that our open access model is something that would be cut because it's cheap. I think it's because we are a younger publisher that we're primarily vulnerable. And when you see learned societies who want to flip to new open access presses, this is a risk that they will be weighing as well, in that they worry about the ongoing viability of younger publishers, in quotation marks. I guess the question might be, how young a publisher do you have to be called young? We're 7 years old since we first announced we were going to do this, 5 years old since we started publishing. That's not Cambridge University Press level of old, but it's not born yesterday either now. So I'm interested at the point at which we say, okay, we've succeeded and this is really rolling and is stable. Well, we're always going to be thought of as young because we're doing things that are different. And is it that difference from the mainstream that actually distinguishes presses that are more vulnerable than others? Just check my notes quickly. The last thing I wanted to talk about was the different artifact types that we have in the humanities and the importance of the monograph in particular. I'm involved in a project called COPIM that's funded by Research England, and the work package that I'm leading there is attempting to implement alternative business models for existing presses who want to transition to make books work in an open access format. I appreciated Ruth talking about alternative formats from Imperial's perspective, but I anticipate not so many of those perhaps are monographs, because these are very important, primarily in the humanities and social scientific disciplines. The problem is that the economics of open access monographs are incredibly complex because they are scaled to a much higher level than you see in the article space. When you're dealing with 80,000 plus words of material per artifact that's taken 3 to 5 years to write, really you're working in a whole different realm of both material economics and symbolic prestige economics for academics. And at the moment, I am not sure that the OLH model is scalable easily for a new press working on open access, but I do think that consortial models, as pioneered by Knowledge Unlatched, for example, have potential for monographs for existing publishers. So I don't know if people know, but several publishers have series of books to which academic institutions can subscribe on a platformized basis. So Cambridge has its core platform, for example, with the Cambridge Companion series of books available, and then you can just subscribe to get the next one in that series. I wonder whether subscribe to open-like models for monographs in this space really could be a way in which we start to see monographs finding a model that isn't a book processing charge of £11,000, sort of $16,000 per artifact. So I'm going to wrap up there. I hope that was kind of interesting humanities perspective, and I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. I think we've probably got more attendees than we would have had in person, so this is absolutely brilliant outcome.
Great, thank you so much, Martin. And for the Q&A portion, we're going to try for the panelists who think that their bandwidth is holding up to turn cameras on. Folks can do that. Hello, everybody. Great, great to see you. So there's some questions coming in. Don't hesitate, folks, to put a question in if one occurs to you, but I've got like a ton of questions. I just want to mention that we will, if your question is specific to pricing, we're not going to get into that today for obvious reasons. So keep your questions general if they're touching up against that. I have tons of questions that I'm going to start since it's my birthday and I can do what I want to. My first question is actually to start for Scott, but anyone can weigh in. Scott, you said that you really needed to start with the data. So if you're a publisher listening here and you're thinking about pursuing a model, what are your suggestions on like the types of data that you should get in front of you so that you can make maybe the most informed decision there?
So before I give the answer to that question, happy birthday. I don't know if we can have like 100 people singing happy birthday to you at the end of this, but that would be interesting. To answer the question, is it possible to share my screen? I don't know who would turn that on. I think we practiced this yesterday, but I don't remember what I think someone has to turn the screen share on.
Something's happening.
Yep, you should see an invitation, Scott.
Great. So, so two things worth talking about. If everybody sees my screen, the first one is you need to be totally transparent about your publishing program, especially if you're one of those societies or publishers that are are asking some universities to pay more for read and publish than they pay for read only. That was something that was a recurring theme in every discussion we've had with universities, with librarians, and also out there in the scientific community. Our authors and our members really wanted to understand what the financials look like. So what we've done, actually, we kind of went to the extreme, and I don't expect everyone will do this, but we wrote an article that's about to be published in our magazine, our flagship magazine, towards the end of April, on our publication finances. And this is actually the proof that we just got back from the typesetters, where we give, maybe it's hard to see the actual numbers, but we give really a lot of detail on both the revenue and where the revenue for publications come, and then on the expenses, you'll see at the bottom of the left page. And then in this article, we go into quite a lot of detail to help the universities understand what it really costs to run a publication program, whether that's journals, magazines, running a platform itself. So that there, and what it costs at a per article level to run those publications. So that's the first piece of data that is really critical to understand. The second piece is on the screen now, which is really understanding in detail where your articles are coming from, what universities are publishing, whether they're journals or conference articles, how many articles are coming from corresponding authors, which seems to be the way that most publishers and societies are defining kind of authorship at this point, to keep it a little bit simpler. And so for us, this took us quite a number of months to get to a point where we had this data for a period of 5 years or so that stretches across, in our case, about 6,000 universities. Keeping in mind, we only have 2,700 subscribers, but we've got about 6,000 universities that do author papers with us. Those kinds of details were really, really critical. So when you go into those discussions with the universities, it's not an abstract discussion about paying for APCs. It's really concrete, because you can see what the numbers are year after year, what the trends are. Is everything moving up? Are things going up and down? Those are kind of there's lots of other data, but those are the two really, really critical pieces that I think everyone needs to have on both sides of the discussion.
Great. Stephen or Martin, do you want to weigh in on that?
I have a lot of thoughts on that. We have real trouble actually identifying authors in this way. We often have terrible institutional metadata, and there are not widespread use of systems like GRID to actually aggregate this. So even University of Cambridge versus Cambridge University means that somebody has to manually disaggregate this information to break it down. And I guess the other thing I'd say is that writing a transparency report like that admirable effort we've just seen takes an enormous amount of labor, work, effort behind the scenes that adds to your publishing costs in the first place. And so while I think it's admirable and useful that this is done, the increasing demands from transparency come with increasing costs on publishers. I feel like at the moment, the number of demands we're getting for this, we're going to need to hire a full-time transparency officer at our publisher just so that we can write these reports and provide these data to institutions. And that's going to mean that our prices go up as a result. So I guess what I'm saying is there comes a point with very small publishers where these demands for transparency actually add overhead and negate their very purpose of being small and low cost. And so some kind of flexibility around that level of transparency is definitely useful at the low end of the spectrum, where you just say, actually, you know what, if we're paying below a certain amount, as long as they're delivering on value that seems to be coming from our authors at our institution, we're not going to insist on this kind of data-driven breakdown to that extreme.
Great. Stephen?
Well, I'd echo what Scott said. It's really important that you understand what your customers are spending with you for their read licenses and to what extent they're publishing with you. And in many cases, it's not a good balanced match. And when you go into any negotiation with an individual institution or a consortium, you've got to understand what it would mean for them moving from one publishing model or reading model to another. So we do the same kind of work that Scott's done. We've been doing it for several years, so that when we go into those discussions, we understand where both parties stand. And the universities want to know that too. It's essential for them.
Thank you. I do want to bring our librarians into the conversation here, and I do have a question from an attendee, but I just wanted first to offer you the opportunity to respond to anything that's been mentioned so far.
On the transparency discussion, I'm still hedging around that one. I think it's very important that we know what, and I mean collectively, we know what we are paying for and we know what we're spending. I think there's probably a feeling that the big deal led to a lot of confusion and obscuring of costs, and I think it's important that we don't get to that again. One of my concerns has been that with the range, up until now, the range of discounts on APCs, the different types of memberships, that if you give us this amount of money, we'll give you this, we would start to hide the costs of open access publishing to the point that we would get to another stage in, say, 5 years' time where nobody knew actually what we were paying for. That's my take on it at the moment. The data behind it all is really difficult. It's very hard. I'm not a metadata librarian. Other people love it lots more than me, but I know how important it is. And that is something that really also has to be made much more available with standards agreed in order to be able to reach some type, I think, of agreement of what transparency can mean and how we can actually then properly look across what things are costing. I hope some of that made sense.
Yes, Lisa? Lisa, did you want to respond to that?
I think I might have been taking a different direction with the things I was thinking about, but one of the things I sort of pondering as I started my career in a community college. You know, I mean, honestly, there's far more content.
Great. Lisa, you're breaking up just a little bit. I don't know if other people are having some trouble there. Can you try again?
I'll try again. Is this better?
Yes, that's better.
Okay. Those are the things that I'm thinking about, and I mentioned that I started community college, and honestly, there is so much content available if I were still in that community college to my students than ever I could have dreamed of. And in fact, you know, we struggled to buy books in order to keep some journal literature. That's part of the context here. So my question that I'm pondering as well is, when do what we are considering read libraries cancel? I mean, like, I'm struggling to think in sort of like a distribution of resources. If 80% of this journal is now open because of various other things, you know, why wouldn't I cancel? Even though it's going to mess up the model, Scott, for example.
Scott, go ahead.
Thank you. So I hate to keep asking you to do this, but if you can share your screen, share my screen again, I can answer that.
Good. And while we're waiting for the screen to come on, maybe Lisa can pause her video because that might help her with her audio. So go ahead, Scott.
So is it sharing yet?
Not yet.
Just give me a second. Hang on.
So, I mean, I'll start talking before it comes up on the screen, but I mean, that question is one that we've spent a lot of time thinking about, because almost 70% of our subscribers today, generating 70% of the revenue that we have. Oh, there we go. Great. Are simply not publishing with us. So at what point did those institutions that are paying anywhere between $5,000 and $10,000 a year, at what point did they say, look, enough of our publications are open access that it doesn't make sense for us to pay that amount of money? So one of the things that we did in our model is we created a ramp down for all of those, what we call tier 10 prices. Those, if you think back to the slide that I presented before, that the red row of bottom tier institutions, we're going to reduce their pricing consistently. Anyone that's in that tier 10 that's paying over $7,000, for example, when we hit certain thresholds of openness, we're going to start lowering all of their prices down to a point where, and in our case, it's $2,500 or so, where we think that's a sustainable number for most of those tier 10s, because there's value in having access to the full platform, even if the vast majority of the research articles are open access. But it's a very real question, because for us, this model effectively will not really benefit 68 to 70% of our current customer base.
Thank you for that. As mentioned, we do have a question from one of our attendees that I would like to hear both Lisa and Ruth, as well as Martin and others input. And this question is, do you think it's possible for a library to support several of these models, for example, subscribe to open and transformative agreements, given that the funding seems to come from different sources and APCs seem to be dominating the discussion at a political level? What do you think about the complexity of multiple model support? Ruth?
That's a good question. I wanted to start by saying that, and it might sound idealistic, libraries are about providing access to content to their users. And we're not talking about stopping doing that because something is on open access. We're enabling content to be made available in open access, and nobody is saying that that doesn't come at a cost. So I want to kind of use that as a starting point. So what we're looking at, and this is why, you know, our subscriptions team and my team now are starting to work together more, is what do the agreements mean when they come in to the budgets that we have available to us? And yes, we're not increasing the amount of money, but what we have to look at is, do the models that come in, can we cover those with the budget that we have, which at the moment is divided into something called the subscriptions budget and an open access budget. We're looking at something that is a content budget. So it's not the oh, we can flip everything over to, because we just transfer the money one way to another. It's not saying that, but it's saying if we can not increase the amount of money that we are spending to an unsustainable level, then a mix of models could be possible. So, for example, we contribute to the Open Library of Humanities to ensure that that content is available. The college hasn't got a humanities department. We do provide a lot of teaching around humanities subjects. That's actually increasing on our undergraduate course. But it's about making the content available, and that's our bottom level, I think, of what we want to do. So I'm starting to talk a lot more, rather than about subscriptions and open access as two separate things. It's providing access to content, and that is what libraries have always done and will continue to do. And it's not that it won't cost money, but we need to ensure that it is sustainable. And if those different models ensure that, which at the moment we're at very early stages, but the smaller society ones that are coming through with, for example, subscribe to open, those similar kind of things, they are affordable. And it means as well that subscriptions can continue in that sense, so that authors who don't have access to open access funds will still be able to publish in the journals they want, and we can still support, for example, the small society publishers, which we want to do and which are really important to imperial authors as well as others. That's my take on it.
Lisa?
So let's try this again and see how the audio goes. So I think empirically the answer to your question, Heather, is yes, because every library, many libraries are already supporting all of these models right now. I don't think that's the question so much. The models are sort of like, how do we pay? The issue is the collective amount, right? And so, and the collective amount that has to be borne by specific institutions. So, I mean, a library can have all of these models and the 6 more that come in. Just like we did the same thing, we had journals that we got by being a member of the society. We'd be an institutional member, and then we got the journal. We had all kinds of ways we got content. The issue isn't the model. The issue is the total amount of money and where that money has to come from. So it's very commonly heard in OA 2020, the assumption that there's enough money in the system. Unfortunately, the system isn't paying. The institutions are, libraries are. So it's not just that there has to be enough money, the money has to be in the right places. And then there has to be an argument that, I mean, I know we like to sort of toss off the free rider problem. The point of open access is free writing, free reading. So if you're going to have that, you have to have some other place that the money comes from. And I really just think, like, we look at these things, it's not a hard sell to contribute to supporting open access. It's a hard sell to keep contributing, to contribute more and more and more when there's other things your library or your institution would also like to spend on. And so one does end up in these conversations. It's not a moral question of whether open access is good. It's a question that a dollar can be spent once. I think Martin probably is living this more than any of us.
I want to give a word of caution. We are getting a little bit close to the end of time, and I do want to hear from Martin, but also we had a quick question come in. Is subscribe to open Plan S compliant? Because the paywall could come back. Do you know that, Martin?
It will be compliant at the article level while it's open access. If the paywall comes back in future times, it would not be, is my sense. Whether it counts then as hybrid or not is a different question. I don't know the answer to that. I was just going to bounce off this question about multiple models and just say money in the right places is exactly the problem we're trying to solve by distributing article processing charges away from a central point of focus among many institutions who will pay a lower amount to centrally pool the funds. And I agree that universities can have whatever models they want, but actually our experience of this is that mandates end up constraining what universities do and which models they will support. If a mandate assumes that the article processing charge is the model that will be adopted and makes it easy because they think it on a per article basis, it becomes very difficult to think laterally. And that comes with huge knock-ons for libraries as well, because the microtransactions of managing article processing charges require intense labor at libraries to track, have we paid that fee? Has it actually been made open access? Does it comply with the terms of that funder's agreement, etc.? Whereas other models perhaps get round those kind of overheads by doing a kind of small big deal type setup and ease that burden while coming with other negative drawbacks. So I just think I'm very wary about the way in which mandates are being written at the moment that are constraining our ability to think laterally in terms of business models and librarian assumptions about what gold open access means. It's an article processing charge. It seems problematic. Ruth's shaking her head.
I don't agree that gold means that an APC has to be paid.
Good, I'm glad. I don't either. But I think there are lots of funding documents.
And we're not the ones equating it we're not the ones equating open access with an APC.
That's
Great.
good.
We are coming up on time. There are a few questions people put in that did not get answered. We'll see if we can capture those questions and SSP can respond. But I want to thank our speakers today, and we can do like virtual clapping, I guess. And then I want to hand back over to Mary Beth to close us out.
Okay, thanks, Heather. And I'm just trying to navigate back to my slides. Excellent, thank you. So thanks again, everyone, for participating in today's seminar. Thank you to our speakers for their time and their engaging presentations. I'm sorry that we came up against time at the end. And I want to thank also especially our sponsors, Cabell's and the Charleston Conference. You will receive a post-event evaluation via email. We encourage you to provide feedback and to help us determine topics for future events. Don't miss our upcoming events shown here, including our first Ask the Experts virtual discussion group featuring data scientists. We also have 2 webinars coming up, including the Scholarly Kitchen Spring webinar, as well as a webinar in June developed by our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. See our website, please, for more information. Today's session was recorded and all registrants will be sent a link. This concludes our session today. Have a good day, everyone.